My name is Clara Bennett, and I'm 34 years old. I've worked for over a decade to get to this moment, my long-awaited promotion review. I'd imagined walking into the boardroom 100 times before. In all of those visions, I was the one standing at the head of the table, commanding the room with my work. But that morning, the reality was very different. Before I tell you exactly what happened, let me say this. If you've ever had someone take credit for your hard work, you'll understand the punch I felt in my chest that day. And if you've ever been underestimated, please like this video, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. I read every single comment, and your stories matter to me. I stepped into the boardroom right on time, my heart steady but alert. The polished glass walls reflected the overhead lights, the air faintly scented with coffee and fresh paper. Every detail of this day had been meticulously prepared in my mind. I was ready. Or at least I thought I was. Because the moment I looked at the screen, the air shifted. There it was, my proposal. The slides I had poured months of my life into. The graphs, the charts, the projections, every detail exactly as I'd designed them. Only I wasn't the one presenting them. It was Greg, my boss. He stood there like a conductor leading an orchestra, gesturing with calm authority as he spoke. "As you can see," he said smoothly, "this revised strategy will not only cut overhead by 18%, but also position us ahead of the competition in Q3. This is my personal recommendation moving forward." My personal recommendation. The phrase hit me like ice water. I took a slow step inside, closing the door behind me without a sound. I didn't move toward the table. Not yet. My instinct screamed at me to speak, to shout that what they were seeing was mine. But another voice whispered, "Don't. Watch first. Learn what they've been told." So I slid into a seat in the back, my eyes fixed on the man I had trusted for years. Greg advanced the slides, moving into the section on implementation timelines. I had carefully planned for 6 months to ensure quality control. He'd cut it to 3. Reckless. Impossible without breaking systems that couldn't afford to break. The CEO leaned forward. "Ambitious, but if you're confident—" "I am," Greg replied without hesitation. He clicked to a new slide, a list of contributors. A neat set of names. Mine wasn't there. The applause at the end was polite, even impressed. Executives shook his hand. They didn't look at me maybe because they didn't realize I'd been erased. Or maybe because they'd already accepted the version of the story Greg had been feeding them. As they moved to the next agenda item, I didn't hear a word. My mind was cataloging every clue. The sudden requests Greg had made over the last few months. To review my slides, to help with formatting, to be CC'd on every client email. The friendly check-ins that now felt more like reconnaissance. This wasn't last-minute opportunism. This was premeditated. I left the boardroom quietly, the echo of polite applause still ringing in my ears. The hallway outside felt colder. My heels clicked against the tile, each step sharper than the last. As I passed Greg's office, I caught his voice through the partially closed door. "Yes, it went exactly as planned," he said, the satisfaction in his tone impossible to miss. I kept walking, my face neutral, my mind already shifting gears. I wasn't going to storm in and demand they see the truth, not yet. That would only make me look defensive, even unstable. No, this would require something slower, quieter. The kind of revenge that doesn't start with an explosion, but with a single, calculated spark. Trust doesn't disappear in a single moment. It's worn away so slowly that by the time you realize it's gone, the damage is already beyond repair. When I first met Greg, I thought he was the kind of leader you wanted in your corner. He had the kind of presence that could make an entire room lean in. He wasn't the loudest voice, but the one that made you stop and listen. That kind of influence was rare in corporate life, and I respected it. I'd been with the company for 8 years by the time he became my direct manager. By then, I had earned a reputation for handling complex projects with precision, for making sense of the chaos other people avoided. I worked best under pressure, but my real strength was in seeing the long-term game, building something solid enough to last. Greg seemed to value that, or at least, that's what I believed. In those early months, he positioned himself as a mentor. He told me I had the instincts of an executive and that I needed to start thinking like a leader, not just a project manager. The words felt like an investment in me, and I leaned into that encouragement. He made a point of including me in higher-level meetings, even when my role was only tangentially related. He'd give me a seat at the table, then later ask my thoughts privately, as if my opinion mattered more than anyone else's. And maybe that was the first mistake, believing my perspective mattered to him in the same way his guidance mattered to me. It wasn't until much later that I realized every new responsibility he gave me also came with something else, a shadow of his presence over my work. He never directly interfered. Instead, he'd ask to stay in the loop, requesting regular updates, just to make sure we're aligned. I thought it was natural oversight, the kind a good manager would give to someone they were grooming for bigger things. Looking back, it was an elegant way to collect my ideas without ever leaving his fingerprints on the theft. The promotion review project had been my opportunity to prove myself. Not just as someone who could execute, but as someone who could design and lead a vision from the ground up. I'd been handed the problem of inefficiency in our operations division, a problem that had been draining resources for years. Others had tried to solve it with quick fixes. I wanted to dismantle the inefficiency at its core and rebuild the structure in a way that made failure nearly impossible. I lived inside that project for months, early mornings that bled into late nights, whiteboards filled with timelines, risk maps, and process redesigns. Endless trial runs in our internal systems to make sure the data supported every recommendation I made. The work became so consuming that my own apartment felt like a hotel room I checked into only to sleep. Greg visited my office often during that period. He'd stand just inside the doorway, arms folded, eyes scanning whatever I was working on. He asked careful questions, not enough to derail my momentum, but enough to understand exactly how each piece fit together. I took his interest as a sign he was invested in my success. When he praised me in department meetings, I believed he meant it. When he told others I was the future of this company, I didn't see it as part of a performance. Every so often, he'd make small, seemingly harmless requests. Could I send him editable versions of my slides in case he needed to stand in if I was ever unavailable? Could he be copied on every email to the executive team just for visibility? Could I give him the raw data sets so he could better understand the methodology? I didn't think twice. It's strange, the details you ignore when you trust someone, like the times he would ask for specific metrics even before I'd presented them anywhere else. Or how he'd show up at meetings with talking points I'd never shared outside my immediate project circle. Or how certain executives started approaching him directly with questions about my project instead of coming to me. It all felt like a byproduct of proximity. He was my manager, after all. By the time the final version of my proposal began to take shape, I was running on caffeine and stubbornness. I'd already addressed every possible objection, built contingencies into every timeline, and documented every financial projection with supporting evidence. The plan was airtight because I knew I would have to defend it from every angle in the review. That's why the changes I saw on the screen during the meeting that day felt like such a violation. Greg hadn't just stolen my work, he'd altered it, removed the safeguards, cut the timeline in half, stripped away the careful pacing I had built to protect the integrity of the implementation. I realized then that those months of mentorship had been something else entirely. They had been reconnaissance. Greg had studied me just as closely as he'd studied my work. He'd learned how I thought, how I defended my decisions where I might hesitate. He'd identified exactly which parts of the plan could be made to look bolder to an executive audience hungry for fast results. The brilliance of his approach, if you could call it brilliance, was that he didn't need to create anything himself. All he had to do was reshape what I'd already built into something riskier, flashier, and claim it as his own. And by the time I walked into that boardroom, he had already framed himself as the savior of a project too cautious under my leadership. That was the trap. It had been built so carefully that speaking out in that moment would have been useless. He'd laid the groundwork for weeks, maybe months, making sure every key decision-maker already saw him as the visionary and me as the cautious assistant. When I left the boardroom that day, I knew something important. Greg's takeover wasn't a fluke. It was the result of deliberate, patient positioning. And if I wanted to undo it, I'd have to be just as deliberate. Anger might make you feel strong, but it doesn't win battles like this. You don't beat someone like Greg by being louder. You beat them by being patient. By knowing exactly when to move and making sure that, when you do, there's no way back for them. That day, I walked out of the building with my mind already shifting into that mode. I didn't know the exact steps yet, but I knew one thing with absolute clarity: the story Greg had sold them was about to unravel. The morning after the promotion review, the office felt different. Not quieter, not busier, just altered, like someone had rearranged the furniture in a familiar room. You couldn't quite put your finger on what was wrong, but nothing sat exactly where it should anymore. Word of Greg's breakthrough was spreading fast. I could hear it in snippets of conversation as I passed open doors and cubicles. The murmured praise for his bold thinking, the speculative talk about what his next move would be now that he had cemented his leadership. No one said my name. I moved through the building like an outsider, cataloging faces, tones, and the way people seemed to shift their attention when I walked by. My project, no longer belonged to me in their eyes. It had been transferred, rebranded, claimed by someone else. But perception, I reminded myself, wasn't the same as truth. The first crack in Greg's polished narrative didn't come from anything I said. It came from the work itself. In my office, I began pulling up older files from the project's early stages. Drafts, data runs, contingency maps, anything that showed the evolution of the plan from concept to near completion. I wasn't looking for anything new. I already knew the content by heart. What I wanted was a trail, something that would be undeniable if the moment came to prove ownership. Greg had always been careful. He never edited my documents directly. He asked for copies, keeping his hands clean of any traceable changes. But the advantage of having built something from the ground up is that you know every version like you know your own handwriting. Even the smallest deviation stands out. As I scrolled through, the pattern was obvious. My early drafts carried the cautious pacing and multi-layered safety protocols I'd spent months refining. Greg's version, the one he presented, had those stripped away. In isolation, his changes looked like daring innovation. Side by side, they looked like someone had taken a solid, carefully engineered bridge and decided to cut out half the support beams because they didn't like how long it took to cross. I needed more than that. Evidence is useless if it only exists in your private folders. It has to be something that can withstand the weight of scrutiny from people who don't want to believe they've been fooled. That's when I noticed something strange. The access logs for my shared folders showed timestamps from late nights when I hadn't been in the office. Someone had been pulling files while I wasn't there, not en masse, but in small, deliberate extractions. Enough to avoid raising alarms, but consistent enough to show a pattern. Greg had covered his tracks well, but the logs didn't lie. They weren't conclusive proof, but they were a start. The real opportunity came 3 days later. I was walking past one of the glass-walled conference rooms when I saw Linda, one of the senior strategy directors, leaning over a printed slide from the presentation. Her brow was furrowed in a way that told me something wasn't adding up. When she noticed me, she gave a small nod. "Clara," she said, tilting the page slightly, "these projections, they don't match the operational benchmarks from last quarter. Did you see the final version Greg presented?" I kept my expression neutral, even as the thought sparked. "I did," I said carefully. "And you're right. They're different." She didn't press further, but the flicker of doubt in her eyes stayed with me. That was the thing about overpromising. It might win the room for a day, but sooner or later, someone starts asking the wrong questions. From that moment, I paid close attention to those small fractures. They weren't big enough to expose Greg yet, but they were there. An operations lead quietly questioning the accelerated schedule. A client request for clarification that didn't get a straight answer. A technician privately expressing concern about the testing phase being bypassed. I didn't interfere. I just listened. Documented. Waited. Greg, meanwhile, was in constant motion, scheduling high-profile meetings, holding court in his office, working the corridors like a politician on the campaign trail. He thrived on momentum, and I could see he was trying to cement his position before the shine wore off. That urgency was telling. People who know they're on solid ground don't need to run this fast. Still, the danger for me was just as real. A misstep, an outburst, even the appearance of undermining him could be spun into the narrative he'd already begun weaving, that I was bitter, obstructive, unable to accept change. So I stayed visible but silent. I attended project updates when invited, nodded in the right places, kept my tone professional. To the casual observer, I looked like someone who had accepted the transition gracefully. But beneath the surface, I was mapping every weak point in Greg's stolen structure. The single conversation I allowed myself during this period came late one evening as the office was emptying out. I ran into Nuri's, our lead systems architect, as she was packing up her laptop. She paused, glanced around to make sure we were alone, and said quietly, "These timelines won't hold." I didn't respond right away. I just met her gaze and gave a small nod. That was all. No promises, no conspiracies, no overt alliances. But it was enough to know I wasn't the only one who could see the cracks forming. From there, my focus shifted. I started reconstructing the original plan in a way that could be deployed instantly if the opportunity arose. Not just as a defense of my work, but as a viable lifeline for the company when Greg's version inevitably began to fail. The trick wasn't in proving he'd stolen it. That might satisfy me personally, but it wouldn't necessarily convince the executives. People in power rarely want to admit they've been wrong, especially if it means dismantling something they've already endorsed. No, the real win would be showing them that his approach wasn't just unethical, it was unsustainable. That when it broke, I already had a solution ready to go. It was a waiting game now. And waiting, I was starting to realize, could be just as strategic as acting. Every day Greg kept pushing his accelerated plan was another day closer to the moment the weight of those missing support beams would become too much to hold. I didn't need to be the one to knock his bridge down. I just needed to be standing on solid ground when it fell. Momentum can blind a room. Once people believe they've found the winning path, they stop looking for warning signs. Greg knew that and used it. He kept feeding the executives quick updates, colorful slides, and confident declarations. But momentum's worst enemy is measurement, and measurement doesn't care about charm. The internal review was scheduled for Thursday morning. It wasn't the kind of meeting anyone looked forward to, no grand speeches or applause, just numbers, risk reports, and the quiet weight of technical reality. The invite list was telling: operations, architecture, compliance, finance, and infosec. People whose job was to see past the polish. I took a seat at the back of the room, far enough to watch without being watched. Greg was already at the front, jacket off, sleeves rolled, playing the part of a leader in the trenches. The first slide appeared, clean green bars, percentages climbing in the right direction. Executives love slides like that. Heads nodded. Pens tapped. Then the second slide came up and the room's temperature shifted. The latency graph, a line that should have been stable, was spiked with thin red peaks. I knew that pattern immediately. It was the signature of skipping staged validation, bursts of instability that hinted at deeper problems under the surface. Greg called them minor anomalies, the kind you expect during optimization. His tone was steady, but I could see the architecture lead narrowing his eyes at the screen. No one interrupted. That was the polite thing in these rooms, let the presenter finish before the questions begin. But the silence that followed wasn't agreement. It was calculation. Operations took control of the display and pulled up the failover logs. A heavy red block filled the middle of the screen, from late the night before. A system had failed in testing and taken hours to recover. Then compliance added their layer, missing sign-off steps, skipped verification phases. The picture was clear, Greg's plan was cutting corners, and the system was already feeling it. I stayed still. My role in that room wasn't to speak yet, it was to remember. InfoSec brought up authentication warnings from stress tests. Not breaches, but close enough to make an auditor lose sleep. They matched almost perfectly with the latency spikes. Architecture added another note, unexpected loads on a subsystem that shouldn't have been handling them yet. The accelerated rollout was colliding with infrastructure limits. Greg answered with business language. He talked about ambition, competitive advantage, and the need to move fast. But this audience wasn't made up of people who could be dazzled by talk. They dealt in thresholds and margins, not slogans. I watched the small tells, a CFO's pen slowing mid-note, a compliance officer highlighting a line, the operations director leaning back instead of forward. Any one of those meant little. Together, they meant the room was no longer fully on Greg's side. Finance brought up the cost model. On paper, Greg's timeline looked efficient until the real utilization numbers were applied. Costs swelled. Overtime projections doubled. Vendor fees stacked like bricks. Risk reserves crept upward. The model didn't break dramatically, it sagged under its own weight. Then came the test environment summary from Nuri's. A grid of pass, fail, and conditional pass results filled the screen. It wasn't the red squares that worried me. Red means you stop. It was the yellow. Yellow means almost, and almost can sink a project faster than outright failure. Greg reframed the yellows as momentum indicators, the reds as expected growing pains. But the charts were saying something else entirely, that his timeline was forcing instability to compound instead of resolve. Halfway through the review, the CFO turned to me. "Brief perspective," she asked. I kept my answer short, my one allowed piece of dialogue. "Rushing sequential validation into parallel windows turns localized risk into systemic risk." The sentence landed. Heads turned back to the screen. The review ended without drama. No verdicts were handed down. Instead, action items were assigned: architecture to prepare a mitigation plan, operations to restage a proper load test, compliance to audit the skipped steps, finance to revise reserves, InfoSec to monitor the weak points. On paper, these were standard follow-ups. In reality, they were the first quiet votes against Greg's plan. Greg thanked the room and walked out with measured confidence, the kind that says, "I'm still in control." A few followed him. Most didn't. I stayed until the screens went dark. The silence after a meeting like that feels like a stage after the curtain falls, the scenery still there, but the story shifting in people's minds. Back at my desk, I opened my shadow file, a reconstruction of my original plan. It wasn't a legal defense. It was a deployment kit, ready to go the second Greg's version began to fail. Every step had a purpose. Every phase had safety built in. It was bold enough to move fast, but grounded enough to hold under pressure. I added fresh notes from the review where the cracks showed first, where they'd likely spread next. I wasn't rooting for his plan to collapse. That would hurt the company, the clients, and the team. But I knew collapse was inevitable if he kept pushing this way. And when it happened, someone would need a lifeline ready. Late in the afternoon, as the office thinned, I got a calendar invite for a strategy/operations joint session the next morning. No agenda. No explanation. Just a guest list full of people with the authority to change the direction of a project. On my way out, I passed Greg's office. The lights were on, and he was hunched over his desk, reviewing something with the calm focus of a man who still believed the storm would pass. He didn't look up. In the reflection of the glass wall beside me, I saw myself walking, not the version Greg had erased in that boardroom, but the one quietly building her way back into the frame. Not with speeches, not with confrontation, but with the kind of preparation that makes survival look effortless when the moment comes. Truth, like systems, is patient, and I'd learned to be patient too. Tomorrow would ask harder questions. I was ready to let the answers speak for themselves. The strategy/operations joint session appeared on my calendar like a shadow. No subject line. No attachments. Just a time, a place, and a list of attendees that included every department with the power to redirect the future of the integration project. Meetings without agendas have a certain gravity. They pull you in whether you want to be there or not, because the absence of details becomes its own message. Something's shifting. I arrived early. The room was one of the larger conference spaces, its glass walls offering a full view of the skyline. The table was polished to a perfect reflection. Every chair was pushed in as if awaiting inspection. I chose a seat at the far side, close enough to hear everything but not at the focal point of the table. From here, I could observe without being drawn in too soon. People trickled in. The operations lead, expression unreadable. The CFO, flipping through her phone but pausing at intervals to glance toward the door. The architecture lead, carrying a slim folder I recognized from system validation reports. Greg entered last, carrying no papers at all, just a sleek black pen and the same composure he'd worn in every high-profile setting since taking over the project. The meeting began without preamble. Operations spoke first, reviewing the revised load test results. The screen filled with metrics and graphs, columns of pass, fail, and conditional outcomes. The fails weren't catastrophic yet, but they were appearing sooner and more frequently than the models had predicted. The conditional results, the yellows, had doubled since the last review. Architecture took over next. Their report wasn't theatrical. They didn't accuse anyone. They simply walked through the dependencies in the accelerated plan, pointing out where sequential processes had been forced to run in parallel. Each one introduced risk. Each one increased the chance of cascading failure. They explained how, in complex integrations, the real danger isn't the first thing that breaks. It's the chain reaction that follows. The CFO listened without expression, but I could see the way her pen paused when certain costs were mentioned. Penalties for delayed client deliverables, the expense of emergency vendor support, the escalation of insurance premiums tied to operational risk. Finance doesn't raise its voice. It simply sharpens its numbers until no one can ignore them. Through all of this, Greg remained composed. He framed the concerns as early adjustment pains and insisted that the plan was on the right trajectory. His tone was calm, measured, the kind of tone that invites people to trust his certainty over their own doubts. But trust erodes fastest when reality starts to leave marks. When the floor opened for discussion, questions came in measured tones. Could the parallel testing be broken back into sequence without losing too much time? Were there interim milestones that could be guaranteed to clients without risking the full delivery? Could the most unstable components be isolated until they passed all validations? I listened, adding each question to my mental map. Every one of them was a step closer to the plan I had built months ago, the one Greg had stripped down for speed. They didn't know it yet, but the direction they were searching for already existed. Then the question came, the only moment of direct attention toward me in the entire meeting. The CFO turned her chair slightly in my direction. "Clara," she said, "you've worked on this from the start. From a risk standpoint, where would you stabilize first?" It was my one dialogue line, and I treated it like precision work. "Start with the integration points that can't fail without triggering system-wide disruption," I said. "Secure those first, build outward from there." No more, no less, just enough to be both specific and unassailable. The conversation moved on, but I'd planted something. For the next 40 minutes, the group dissected timelines, resources, and contingency planning. Greg kept his answers confident, but his shoulders were a fraction tighter than usual. He knew that questions like these, left unanswered for too long, would widen into openings. By the time the meeting ended, there was no grand decision, no dramatic shift. Instead, there was something subtler, the consensus that adjustments were inevitable. And once you accept that, you also accept that the current plan isn't untouchable. I left the room without looking back at Greg. I didn't need to. The silence that followed us down the hallway said enough. Back at my desk, I pulled up my shadow file again. I'd been refining it quietly for weeks, incorporating each new crack I saw in Greg's plan. This time, I added the specific concerns voiced in the meeting, the unstable integration points, the risks of parallel processing, the financial penalties for delays. Each note made the alternative plan stronger, more aligned with the questions the executives were already asking. I wasn't just building a safety net anymore. I was building the exact solution they would reach for when they realized Greg couldn't deliver. Late in the day, a small but telling signal arrived, an invitation from the architecture lead for a technical review session the following week. No Greg on the attendee list, just the people who actually understood the systems in play. These weren't open acts of rebellion. They were quiet divergences, small groups forming around the work itself, away from the stage where Greg liked to stand. The kind of movements that don't announce themselves until they're ready to be seen. As the office emptied, I sat for a moment longer, letting the weight of the day settle. Meetings without agendas rarely end cleanly. They plant seeds in the form of questions that follow people into their private thoughts. Those questions grow in the quiet, in the car on the way home, over dinner, in the space between closing your eyes and falling asleep. Greg could hold the spotlight for now, but the shape of the conversation was changing, and once that change begins, it's nearly impossible to reverse. The week after the joint session moved differently. It wasn't loud, but it was noticeable. A shift in how people moved through the building, how they chose their words, how long they lingered in conversations. The project still belonged to Greg on paper, but the confidence that had once surrounded him wasn't as airtight as before. I could see it in the subtle changes. Emails that used to be addressed solely to Greg now included me in the CC line. Questions that had been sent directly to him were starting to land in my inbox again. They were small things, almost invisible unless you knew how to look for them, but they told me the center of gravity was beginning to tilt. The first real sign came from architecture. They had been running deeper tests on the unstable integration points, the same ones I'd flagged in my original plan as high risk. The results weren't good. Failures that had been considered unlikely under my timeline were now cropping up with uncomfortable frequency under Greg's accelerated schedule. Each failure required workarounds. Each workaround created new variables no one had time to fully test. When architecture quietly shared their findings with operations, it set off a chain reaction. Operations escalated to compliance, concerned about what the failures meant for contractual obligations to clients. Finance was pulled in next, calculating the cost of delay penalties versus the cost of scaling up resources to try and keep pace with the original promises. Greg still held his composure in public. He didn't show frustration, didn't raise his voice, didn't admit to strain. But I could see the difference in the way he moved, a little more speed in the hallways, a little less patience in meetings that weren't going his way. My role in this stage was still the same: stay quiet, stay useful, stay ready. If I moved too soon, I'd become part of the problem in their eyes. If I moved too late, Greg could still find a way to spin the collapse as something beyond his control. Timing mattered more than anything. Midweek, I got a request from Nuri's to review the latest technical report before it was sent to the executive team. "Just want to make sure we're not overstating stability," her message read. It was my one moment of dialogue in the chapter, and I kept it short. "I'll be careful," I told her. The report didn't need much revision. The numbers spoke for themselves. The system wasn't holding under the accelerated load, and no amount of business language could disguise that. The failures were no longer theoretical. They were measurable, repeatable, and expensive. That same day, I noticed Greg in a closed-door meeting with the CFO. They stayed inside for nearly an hour. When they emerged, his expression was still calm, but hers was not. She walked away without a word, already typing something into her phone. By Thursday, a new meeting appeared on my calendar: Integration Project Contingency Planning. Greg was on the invite list, but so was every senior technical lead, every compliance officer, and every major client representative dialed in remotely. It wasn't a replacement plan yet, but it was the closest the company had come to admitting they might need one. That evening, I stayed late, reviewing my shadow file again. I tightened the sequence of the phased rollout, making it even more adaptable. I added cost estimates that were realistic but still competitive, along with a side-by-side comparison showing how it could deliver high-impact wins early without risking full system failure. It struck me how different my mindset was from the beginning of this. In those early days after Greg's takeover, my focus had been on proving the theft, gathering evidence, making the case. But now the theft was almost secondary. What mattered more was restoring the project itself, giving it the foundation it needed to survive past the mess he'd made. Greg's failure would be public soon enough. But when it happened, I didn't want to just stand there saying, "I told you so." I wanted to walk into the room with the solution already in hand. By the end of the week, the cracks in Greg's authority were no longer hairline fractures. They were visible, structural lines running through the project. The people around him weren't confronting him directly, but they were adjusting their positions, like passengers subtly shifting away from a railing that feels unsteady. And I stayed exactly where I needed to be, close enough to watch, far enough not to be caught in the collapse. The pressure points were showing. It was only a matter of time before someone pressed hard enough for the whole thing to give way. By the start of the next week, the company's conversations about the integration project had developed a new rhythm. The confident "when this is done" had shifted to a cautious "if we can deliver." Greg still spoke in absolutes, but the air around him no longer carried the same weight. People were listening politely instead of leaning in. I'd been watching the cracks widen for weeks, but now they were starting to make noise. Operations was pushing back more openly on the timelines. Architecture was requesting additional testing windows instead of just suggesting them quietly. Compliance was logging every skipped step in official reports rather than internal notes. On Tuesday morning, a calendar invite appeared in my inbox. Client alignment session. The sender was Brighton, the CEO. The guest list included Greg, the CFO, the heads of operations and architecture, and, to my surprise, me. It wasn't standard for someone in my position to be in a direct alignment meeting with top clients. If I was being included, it meant one of two things. Either they expected a technical question Greg couldn't answer, or they were quietly preparing for the possibility that his plan was about to unravel in front of the people it would hurt most. The session was set for Thursday afternoon. That gave me 2 days. 2 days to prepare for whatever might happen in that room, whether it was the slow erosion of Greg's credibility or the sudden collapse of his authority. I spent those days tightening my contingency plan one last time. I refined the phased rollout so that each stage ended in a visible, measurable win for the clients. I adjusted the timeline to show how we could deliver those wins without risking the system's stability. I pulled together a single-page summary with just enough technical detail to be credible, but not so much that non-technical executives would lose the thread. In the past, I would have filled it with every piece of data I had, convinced that the more proof I provided, the stronger my case would be. I'd learned better now. Proof matters, but so does clarity. You have to hand people something they can understand in a single glance. The morning of the meeting, I arrived early. The boardroom was already set up, with name cards in front of each seat and a polished carafe of water at the center of the table. The large monitor at the far end of the room displayed the company logo against a neutral background. Greg came in 5 minutes before the start, carrying only a tablet and that same air of control he'd worn since the day he took my project. He made small talk with Brighton, smiling easily. But I noticed his fingers tapping against the edge of the tablet, a subtle rhythm, almost imperceptible, that betrayed a different kind of energy underneath. The clients joined via video conference, their faces arranged in neat squares on the screen. Each one represented a contract worth more than the annual budget of some departments. They didn't need a tour of the company's capabilities. They needed assurances that the promises made to them would be kept. Greg began with a high-level overview. He talked about progress, about innovation, about the competitive advantage the accelerated plan would deliver. His voice was steady, his phrasing practiced. But then the questions started. One client asked about a specific integration milestone that, according to Greg's last update, should have been completed the previous week. Greg assured them it was in progress and on track, but the architecture head shifted uncomfortably in their chair. Another client asked whether the accelerated timeline left enough room for full security validation before launch. Greg smiled and said, "Absolutely," but I saw InfoSec's lead glance at their notes before looking back at the camera. The tension in the room wasn't open yet, but it was palpable, like humidity before a storm. Then came the moment I'd been waiting for. A client rep leaned forward in their video frame and asked, "If unexpected issues arise, what's the fallback plan to ensure our delivery isn't delayed?" Greg paused just slightly before answering. "Our current approach minimizes the likelihood of that scenario, so we're confident fallback measures won't be necessary." It was the wrong answer. The kind of answer that sounds good in a press release, but makes clients nervous in a closed-door meeting. Brighton turned his head toward me. "Clara," he said, "from a technical perspective, how would you structure a fallback to protect delivery dates?" It was my one dialogue for the chapter, and I made it count. "I'd phase the rollout," I said, "prioritizing the components that are most critical to each client first, ensuring they're stable before integrating the next set. That way, even if an issue arises in later stages, the most important deliverables remain unaffected." I kept it short, precise, and I didn't look at Greg. The client nodded and Brighton moved the meeting forward without comment, but the shift had happened. The question hadn't been mine to answer until it was, and now my voice was in the conversation. For the rest of the session, the discussion circled around milestones, testing protocols, and the potential impact of any further delays. Greg still held the lead role, but the spotlight wasn't fixed entirely on him anymore. It was starting to move. When the meeting ended, the clients signed off with polite goodbyes. Brighton thanked everyone and left the room quickly, taking the CFO with him. Greg lingered, speaking briefly with operations, his tone measured but lacking the easy flow from earlier. I left without engaging him. There was no need. The opening had been made and it hadn't been forced. It had come naturally in response to a question the clients wanted answered. Back at my desk, I added the moment to my notes, the exact phrasing of the question, the sequence of events that led to it, the reaction it received. These were the markers of a turning point, and they were worth preserving. By the end of the day, another meeting invite appeared in my inbox. This one was from Brighton's assistant. The subject line was simple: "Follow-up integration strategy." The guest list was shorter. Greg was still on it. So was I. The invitation didn't say what the follow-up would involve, but I didn't need it spelled out. The storm wasn't here yet, but the air was heavy, and the clouds were gathering. The follow-up meeting was scheduled for the next morning at 9. No time to prepare a new presentation. No buffer of days to anticipate the shape of the conversation. When something is set that quickly, it's not about scheduling convenience. It's because momentum is shifting, and the people in control want to move before it stalls. The guest list was small, Brighton, the CFO, Greg, and me. A meeting of that size, with no department heads or secondary staff, was surgical by nature. It meant decisions would be discussed at a level where there was no room for posturing. I arrived 10 minutes early. The boardroom was dim, morning light filtering in through half-closed blinds. The air smelled faintly of coffee, the strong, bitter kind served in small quantities at serious meetings. Brighton was already there, reviewing something on a tablet. The CFO sat opposite him, pen in hand, writing quick notes on a legal pad. Greg entered a moment later, with the same careful composure he had worn for weeks, but his shoulders seemed tighter. We began without ceremony. Brighton started by summarizing the key points from the client session. He spoke plainly about their concerns: the missed milestone, the security validation question, the lack of clarity around fallback planning. His tone wasn't accusatory, but it had the firmness of someone who intended to see those concerns resolved. Greg responded with his usual control. He described the setbacks as minor friction points and assured us they were well within our ability to correct without altering the overall timeline. He spoke about confidence, competitive positioning, and the need to maintain the pace of delivery. The CFO leaned forward, interrupting him gently but decisively. She laid out the cost implications of failure in stark terms: penalty clauses, strained client relationships, reputational risk in the market. Her figures were exact, and there was no mistaking their weight. Numbers, when presented like that, leave no room for charm to soften them. Brighton turned to operations data next. Without the heads of those departments present, he had condensed their input into a simple conclusion: The system could not sustain the current schedule without escalating the probability of critical failure. Greg didn't argue with the numbers directly. Instead, he reframed them, said that risk was inherent in innovation, that extraordinary gains require extraordinary resolve. It was a well-delivered line, but I could see Brighton wasn't convinced. His gaze shifted to me. "Clara," he said, "you've been close to both the original plan and the current approach. If we were to stabilize delivery without sacrificing client trust, what would it take?" That was my one dialogue line for the chapter. "Refocus on the most critical deliverables for each client, secure them first, and sequence the rest," I said. "You preserve trust by delivering what matters most, even if it means adjusting the broader rollout." The words hung in the air for a moment. The CFO made a quick note. Brighton's expression didn't change, but his silence was telling. The kind of pause leaders take when they're measuring whether a shift in direction will cost more politically than it will save operationally. Greg spoke again, leaning forward slightly. He warned that slowing the rollout would hand opportunities to competitors, that the boldness of the accelerated plan was part of its strength. But as he talked, I noticed something. He was explaining more than he used to, adding layers of justification where before he had simply stated and moved on. Confidence that needs explanation isn't the same as real confidence. The discussion moved into specifics. Brighton wanted to know exactly which integration points were at highest risk. The CFO asked what the financial burn rate would be if we added 2 months to the timeline. Greg had answers, but they were broad, summaries, not specifics. And in this room, summaries weren't enough anymore. When Brighton finally closed his tablet, he said nothing about a decision. He simply stated that contingency measures would be prepared in parallel with the current plan, and that all project updates would now be reviewed in smaller sessions before going to clients. It was a partial shift, not a full one. Greg still had nominal control, but the creation of a parallel track was a warning. You don't prepare a contingency unless you're already considering using it. As we left the room, I didn't look at him. My role wasn't to celebrate small victories or provoke confrontation. It was to be ready. The shadow file on my drive wasn't just a plan anymore. It was a living document, now aligned almost perfectly with the questions Brighton was beginning to ask out loud. Back at my desk, I made fresh notes on the meeting, the exact moments where Greg hesitated, the points where Brighton's tone shifted, the details the CFO pressed on. Each one was a signpost. By late afternoon, I got another small signal, an invite from the architecture lead for a closed-door technical session the next day. The subject line was simple: feasibility review. Greg's name wasn't on the list. These sessions were where the real groundwork happened. They were quiet, precise, and entirely about what could be done, not about how it would look. They didn't make headlines inside the company, but they wrote the script for the meetings that did. I accepted the invite without comment. That night, as I walked to my car, I thought about the arc of the last few weeks. The theft of my project had started with a single meeting where I had been erased. Now, we were walking toward another meeting, one that might mark the moment I began to reappear. Greg still had the title of project lead, but leadership is about more than titles. It's about whose plan the room will trust when trust is the only thing holding the work together. And in that boardroom, I could feel that trust beginning to move, not in a dramatic wave, but in a slow, deliberate shift, like water finding its way through stone. Tomorrow would be another step, and I intended to take it. The feasibility review meeting was set for 8 a.m, and it carried the kind of weight you could feel in the air before you even walked into the room. When I arrived, the space was already alive with quiet intensity. The architecture lead sat at one end of the table, flipping through diagrams. The systems integration manager was reviewing a flowchart on her laptop. 2 senior engineers were in the corner, speaking in low, clipped sentences about API stability. Greg wasn't there. That absence alone told me everything. This meeting wasn't for optics, it was for truth. I sat down, opened my notebook, and listened. The lead began by walking through the core modules one by one. He didn't sugarcoat the gaps. Security compliance wasn't just in progress. It was missing critical components. The fallback systems weren't planned. They were non-existent. Dependencies between teams were stacked in ways that made a single failure ripple outward like a chain reaction. The conversation was blunt. Every flaw was logged. Every potential failure had a name, a probability, and a cost attached. In that space, no one was performing for a client or a senior executive. We were simply measuring whether the current approach was possible. Half an hour in, the architecture lead turned to me. "Clara, your original plan, would these issues exist there?" That was my one dialogue line. "Not in this configuration," I said. "The sequence and integration order in my plan isolated these modules. A failure in one wouldn't pull the others down." The silence after I spoke wasn't hostile. It was the silence of people recalculating. For the rest of the meeting, my name came up more than once. Not as an accusation or a courtesy, but as a reference point. My timeline. My deliverables. My approach. Each time the room used my plan as a measure against the one Greg had been pushing. By the time we wrapped, the conclusions were clear. The accelerated rollout was high risk to the point of recklessness. Adjustments were possible, but they would require scaling back to something much closer to the framework I had built months ago. I left the meeting with my notebook, heavier than when I'd arrived. Not physically, but with the kind of weight that comes from knowing you're closer to regaining what was taken from you. That afternoon, Brighton called for a closed leadership session. The invite was short, strategic realignment discussion. Greg's name was included this time, which meant the tone would shift. When we gathered in the boardroom, the atmosphere was polite but brittle. Brighton opened by summarizing the feasibility review's findings. He didn't embellish them, didn't soften them, just stated the facts with the quiet authority of someone who had no interest in pretending. Greg listened, nodding slowly, his expression unreadable. When it was his turn to speak, he acknowledged the challenges but insisted the accelerated approach was still viable with targeted mitigation. He spoke with the same confidence as before, but now I could hear the subtle tension beneath it, the tone of someone defending ground they knew they were losing. The CFO weighed in next. She backed the architecture team's conclusions, pointing out that continuing without structural adjustments would not only risk the project, but also the company's position with its largest client. Her words landed hard. Numbers and operational truth have a way of cutting through even the best rhetoric. Brighton let the discussion run its course, then made his decision. The rollout would be scaled back. The integration sequence would follow the architecture team's recommendations that, in practice, mirrored my original plan. There was no applause, no dramatic reveal. Just a quiet, definitive shift in direction. Greg didn't look at me, but I didn't need him to. I had no interest in gloating or locking eyes in some silent contest. My focus was on the work, and on the fact that I was now, once again, at the center of it. In the days that followed, my role expanded naturally. The leadership team began looping me into conversations before Greg. The architecture lead sent me direct updates. The client reached out to me for clarification on deliverables. It wasn't formal, but it was real, influence replacing title, trust replacing hierarchy. Late one evening, as I was reviewing timelines in the quiet of an almost empty office, Brighton stopped by. He didn't sit, just stood by the door. "Clara, you've handled the last few weeks well," he said. "We'll talk more about official roles soon." Then he left, as simply as he'd come. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't even a confirmation. But it was an acknowledgement, and in this game, acknowledgement is the first step to everything else. I walked out of the building that night knowing the tide had turned. Greg still held his position in name, but the foundation beneath him was cracking. And the difference between someone who holds a title and someone who holds trust is the difference between a wall and a load-bearing beam. Only one of them can stand when the pressure changes. The final move was coming, and I was ready for it. The weeks after the realignment were a strange mix of calm and quiet disruption. On the surface, nothing dramatic happened. No loud arguments in boardrooms, no sudden resignations. But underneath, the structure was shifting. I could feel it in the way people routed questions to me instead of Greg. In the way project updates came directly to my inbox before his. In the way the client started referring to Clara's framework in calls without hesitation. Greg must have felt it too. His usual self-assuredness was still there, but it had a forced quality now, as if every smile cost him something. The opportunity for the final move came in the form of an executive review with our client's leadership team. It wasn't just a status check. It was a showcase, the kind of meeting where reputations are cemented or shattered. Brighton asked me to lead the presentation. That single sentence told me everything I needed to know. The shift wasn't just informal anymore. This was trust made visible. I prepared obsessively. Every slide, every data point, every contingency answer was layered with precision. This wasn't about showing competence, it was about making it undeniable who the project truly belonged to. The morning of the review, I arrived early. The conference room had been staged with care, polished glass table, water pitchers aligned, the company's logo glowing on the wall screen. I took my seat at the head, laptop open, notes ready. Greg walked in 10 minutes before start. He took a seat 2 chairs down from me, not at the front. The choice was deliberate, a quiet acknowledgement that the position he once claimed wasn't his anymore. When the client's team arrived, the atmosphere shifted instantly. These were people who measured value in results, not politics. They greeted me warmly, some by name, a few even with thanks for fixing the rollout path. I could feel Greg's silence next to me, heavy and contained. I began the presentation. My voice was steady, my pacing deliberate. I walked them through the revised timeline, highlighting the modular integration and the reduced risk points. I didn't need to mention that this was my original design. The architecture spoke for itself. At one point, the client's CTO interrupted to say, "This approach is exactly what we were hoping for from the start." I nodded, keeping my face neutral, but inside, that sentence landed like a final checkmate piece sliding into place. Greg's one contribution came midway through when he tried to elaborate on a technical point. I let him speak. There was no need to shut him down. The contrast was enough. His explanation was vague, leaning on buzzwords instead of substance. When the CTO redirected the question back to me for clarification, it wasn't a victory I celebrated outwardly. It was simply the inevitable conclusion to weeks of quiet work. By the time we wrapped, the client expressed full confidence in the revised plan. They approved the updated budget, praised the transparency of the risk assessment, and even hinted at expanding our contract. The mood was optimistic, almost buoyant. After the call ended and the client disconnected, the room stayed quiet for a beat. Brighton looked at me and simply said, "Excellent work, Clara." Then he stood, gathering his notes, and left. It was such a small sentence, but in that room, in that moment, it was a declaration. 2 days later, the official announcement came. Greg was being reassigned to a non-client-facing role to focus on internal operations. The language was careful, but the meaning was clear. He was out. That same afternoon, Brighton called me into his office. The promotion I had been expecting weeks ago was now mine, along with full project ownership. There was no ceremony, no champagne, just the solid, undeniable reality that I had taken back everything that was stolen, and then some. I didn't celebrate in loud ways. There was no need. My revenge had never been about spectacle. It was about truth being recognized in the only language that mattered here: competence, trust, and results. Greg left the floor quietly. I watched him go from my office window, a small figure in the reflection of the glass. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel pity. I felt something steadier, the satisfaction of knowing that the work and the truth behind it had survived every attempt to erase it. Weeks later, when the project's first phase launched successfully, the client sent a thank you gift. Inside was a handwritten note from their CTO. "Leadership isn't about claiming credit. It's about delivering it." I kept that note in my desk drawer, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that sometimes the quietest moves leave the deepest marks. The lesson was clear. In an environment where politics can be as ruthless as any battlefield, patience is the sharpest weapon you can wield. And when you use it well, you don't just win back what's yours, you redefine the game entirely. Now, months later, I still walk into that boardroom for meetings. The table is the same. The logo still glows on the wall, but the seat at the head, that's mine. Not because I fought for it in the loudest way, but because I refused to let go of the truth when it mattered most. And that's a position no one can take from me again. If you've ever had someone take credit for your work, if you've ever been underestimated or overlooked, I want to hear your story. I read every single comment, and your voice matters here.